Welcome to H360 Health Talk. We're here today with Kevin Weadock, author of The River. It is a book about the impact of alcoholism on a New York family as described through the eyes of a young boy. Yes, you've guessed it, it's Kevin. This is a true story, true life story of Kevin's journey through a series of traumatic experiences, family shelters, and foster homes. It illustrates the insidious mechanism of addiction and how it propagates from one generation to the next. In The River, Kevin shares an unvarnished account of his struggles to survive, brokenness, heartache, and hope. Today, Kevin is a biomedical engineer and a proud father of 3 children, Kevin, Morgan, and Emily. He resides in New Jersey with his wife, Patty, and enjoys playing foosball in his spare time. Kevin, welcome to the table.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Well, Kevin, very interesting book, The River, a memoir of your life growing up as a child. And as I mentioned in the introduction, certainly heartbreak, struggles, and hope to survive. I want to start, as I got into the book in the very beginning, it seems like, you say you grew up in an Irish Catholic family. And I grew up in a small community, but a lot of Irish Catholic around our area. And it almost seemed like kind of a normal family. Dad would go off to work, mom would be home. Dad comes home, might stop off for a beer and a shot of Irish whiskey on the way home, but arrives at home and gets in his favorite chair, and he's presented from one child with a newspaper, and another child gets him a beer for maybe another drink before dinner. Seemed like a pretty normal kind of Catholic Irish upbringing.
Yes, in that respect, it may be. What I tried to do in the opening of the book was to just immerse the reader in the earliest memories I have. And they sound sort of benign, just helping my father get a beer when he comes home from work. But even in that brief chapter, which is 1.5 pages, he asked for 2 beers. And so it was just to introduce alcohol into the story and how we were intimately involved with alcohol. It was almost like a connection between us and my father.
Yeah. Now, you're not the only child in the family. There's Dennis and Katie and Patty and Mickey and Donna and Timmy. And then later in the book, we're introduced to Dan and Freddie. Tell me a little about the dynamics between you and your siblings in the family in the early days.
Well, my oldest sibling was Katie. And so Katie, as a young girl, even 8 years old, had assumed some responsibility for the rest of us, which would include my brother Patty, who was 7, my brother Mickey, who was 6, me 5, and Dennis 4. The drinking that my parents did early on, particularly, well, both of them, but my mother drank as well. And so any gaps in terms of mothering us were filled by my sister Katie. My brothers and I were generally feral type kids. We just ran around the neighborhood, even at that young age. And I have many memories of trouble I got into, rides in police cars and things like that.
But it wasn't too long before you noticed that maybe things weren't the typical Irish Catholic family. There was some demonstrated behavior that started to go on. And was there a point where you kind of looked around as a young boy and said, wow, this doesn't seem normal to me?
I never felt that. It all seemed normal to me because I didn't have any context, any reference that I could discern. That was my life. And when I wrote the book, I basically just called it as I experienced it. I didn't want to say this is really abnormal or anything. I just said this is what happened. And so it was all normal to me. That was my life.
Well, what was the dynamics between your mother and your father at that young period of time?
Well, my mother ran away from Minnesota. Her father was an alcoholic. And I wouldn't say he was abusive. He was just negligent. He ran off from home. And so she was raised in poverty in Wisconsin and Minnesota. She ran away to New York when she was 17. She ran away from she was recently discharged from a home for girls, wayward girls, I would call it. And she arrived in Manhattan, met my father, who was also a runaway. He ran away from Ireland, from a family he started there where he had 3 children. And they met in the Chelsea section of New York. They never got married. And they just started having kids. So he was 34, she was 17. At that time, they both drank to treat their own anxiety and whatever else they were going through. So they came into the relationship already with an addiction, if you will, to alcohol.
Yeah. But Chelsea, the Chelsea area of New York probably helped facilitate that. It's kind of, Chelsea even to this day is kind of filled with bars and, an environment where young people can kind of hang out and have a good time.
I wouldn't blame it so much on Chelsea per se. Really what I think the book addresses, and it's sort of my own theory, is that when we speak of alcoholism, there is certainly literature to suggest that it's genetically passed from one generation to the next. But there is an expression or saying that biology loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. So they may have been predisposed to alcoholism, but it was the inability to manage their anxiety and mental illness, if you will, and try to medicate it with alcohol that basically pushed them into that life.
So when the children come along and you're 7, 8, 9 years old and your parents are drinking heavily, your sister's older, and you said she assumed some responsibilities. How did that all work? I mean, obviously you've got kids, you've got school, you've got simple things like putting meals on the table and making sure your kids are fed and clothed. Even those things that are come natural to a lot of people. Was that a struggle?
Yes, and I tried to just touch on that in some of the earlier chapters where I talk about food and so on. And Katie taught us how to make sandwiches, and we used to make sugar sandwiches, and how to toast our bread, and we used to just put it on the end of a fork and put it over the fire. Obviously, not the best food to eat or the way to toast bread, but
the fire wasn't a campfire; it was the fire on the stove in the kitchen. I'm assuming.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's that, and again around food, we looked for food on the street. We looked for food on the beach, in the amusement parks, because we weren't getting it at home all the time. And I do remember my mother being a great cook, but she wasn't always in the frame of mind to cook. And when she couldn't, my sister Katie tried to fill the void, make either SpaghettiOs for us or canned chicken chow mein, things like that.
Now you talk in the book about one beach in particular where it seemed what you I think referenced the rich folks kind of hung out, and you noticed that by the quality of cars in the parking lot. And you mentioned that was a good place to go to look for food because it seemed like those rich people and those rich kids would maybe take one bite out of a sandwich and throw it away, and that was a pretty good meal for you and your brothers.
Yeah. So I don't know if they were rich. They just seemed rich to me. The fact that they would throw food out, to me, felt like they must have been rich.
Yeah.
But they were probably ordinary folk, if you will. That was Rockaway Beach. It's a city beach, so there are thousands of people on the beach. And the garbage cans had holes in them. It was sort of like a metal that had many holes in it, so that when the waves came up, the garbage cans weren't taken out to the water. But that allowed me to look in there and see what kind of food there was.
And did you ever look at those kids and kind of wonder, well, why are they doing this? Why is this? It seems so wasteful when here I can't get a meal at home and I'm seeing all this waste. Why are these kids and these families doing this?
I just thought that they were kind of crazy to throw the food out. I didn't really try to get too intellectual or figure it out. I just wanted that sandwich.
Yeah.
So.
There comes a point in the book where you talk about the family losing the apartment for the first time, and now you're faced with having to find some place to live, having to find being put in a shelter. What was that when you think back about that? What was that? Did you know that it eventually was coming to this and you were preparing to leave, or was it just almost like the switch was flipped and we've got to get out of here because we've lost the apartment?
Well, we had bounced from one apartment to the next and even had to go live with my mother's family in Minnesota for a while. I'm not quite sure what precipitated movement from one apartment to the next. I can say that we moved at least once a year, and I tried to name the streets in the book and what took place in those things. There was a day, which was probably a month or two before I went into the shelter, wherein my mother and my sister Katie rounded the boys up, and we walked along the boardwalk in Rockaway Beach towards a Catholic home for boys in St. John's. And she went into the place, and my brothers and I sat in the gymnasium area outside where my mother was speaking to the priest. And she was trying to see if she could get us to live there. And while we were playing basketball, she was talking to the priest. Well, when she came out of the room, I remember asking her, well, what happened, Mom? And she said, nothing happened. But she was very upset, and I picked up on that. About a month later, I just remember getting up in darkness and getting on a subway train in the dark. And then when I got off the train, it was light. And I was in Jamaica, Queens, another part of the city. And we were saying to our parents, where are we going? What's happening today? And they would say, oh, you're going to a party to meet with some kids. Basically took us to a shelter, a building. It was a sort of like an old building. I describe it in the book. And they brought us to the front office of the place, and we were really unsure what was going to happen. So it's me and my brothers and my sister Katie. And what did happen was my mother and father just went into the office, spoke to some person, Mr. Walsh, and then they left abruptly, and we were left there. And so I have several chapters in the book that detail the trauma of that and a dream that I had. For many years of my life, I had the same dream about that day.
So waking up in the shelter your first night there, waking up the next day, what was that experience like?
I don't remember the next day. I do remember the first day and a woman giving me a pair of blue socks and giving me a tour of the place. But there were no other children there when we were there. They were out at a party. We had just missed the party. So when she finished giving us the tour, we sat in a cafeteria of the building and waited for all the other kids to come. It was Thanksgiving time. So I remember the Thanksgiving stuff on the table. And then when all the kids came in to the room from the party, it was very scary for us. We didn't know anyone. Uh, Most of the children were African American and Hispanic, and it was a little different than the schools I had gone to, which were mostly white kids. So I was a little nervous about that and how I might be treated. But the best thing was that I was treated by the other kids as one of them, and they were my first true friends.
So you go from a couple of shelters, but you end up at a place called Little Flower. And it seemed to be a little bit of a different shelter than you might have experienced in the past. Tell me about Little Flower and what was that like?
Little Flower was a place on the north shore of the east end of Long Island in Wading River. And it was a sort of a campus. The center of the campus had a nice church. And there were little cottages where children lived in. And there was a cliff, and you could go out to the edge of the cliff and see the Long Island Sound. So it was a very beautiful place, and it was buried deep in the woods. And it's very clean, very far from the city. And it really wasn't a shelter per se. It was a holding tank for kids where they could stay until they were placed in foster homes. And
there was a Father Fagan there.
Mm-hmm.
What was he the headmaster of Little Flower? Or?
Yes, he actually is in the world of children's shelters and things in New York. He's a famous person. And he lived in a house on the cliff overlooking the Sound. And we rarely saw him except the church, when we had Mass on Sundays.
And so you mentioned Little Flower is almost a holding tank for children until they get fostered out. And you and your brother Dennis eventually get fostered out, and you go to live with Millie and Isaac Wasser. Mm-hmm. What was that day like? Did you wake up in the morning and do they tell you, Kevin, I've got some good news for you and Dennis. We've got a foster family that you're going to go live with, and things as you may have known it in the past or what your experiences here at Little Flower are about to change?
Sure. So the first day we're at Little Flower, I realized, it's just Dennis and me that live here now. My sister Katie, she was immediately put in a foster home. And my brothers, Pat and Mickey, they were also put in a foster home. So it was just Dennis and I. So my family just got more and more fragmented. And we were at Little Flower for several months when a social worker came and said, I'm going to take you to the foster home where your brothers are, so you can get a sense of what a foster home is like. And that was a Thanksgiving day. And we went there, and we had dinner with them, and the foster mother there asked me, so how do you like living at Little Flower? And I said, it's okay, but the nun that was taking care of us is mean. And just, big mouth kid that I was. But she had told the social worker that I said that, and the social worker told the nun that. So when I got back there, the nun was very angry with me and wouldn't speak with me anymore. And it was sort of a bad thing, but within a week or two, we were placed in our own foster home, Dennis and I, and that was the Wasser's home.
But things look pretty good. You go to take a visit to see what a foster home looks like over Thanksgiving, and other than your little misstep, your comment, things seem to be pretty good going for your brothers.
Yeah, they seemed to like it there. And it was just strange to me to be separated from my family, to see them growing up with other families, not knowing when I would ever live with them again. And when we were placed in the Wasser home, I immediately knew that was bad news for me because of the vibe that I got from the foster parents when I got out of the car on their driveway. They just didn't look right. And they turned out to be a very abusive group of people that, treated us very badly.